Look at today's scripture lesson. It's found in that little Old Testament book of Ruth. We're going to be reading from the first chapter. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons, and they married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughter-in-laws prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. But then Naomi said to her daughter-in-laws, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought that there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? Oh, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again, and then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. And where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." And when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. And so the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." And so Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Well, she came from one of the older, more established families in town, old money, social status. Her descendants were, the charter members of the first Reformed church. She and her hubby ran a successful business. They had 2 sons. But when the economy crashed and the business tanked, they decided, to relocate to some greener pastures down in Chicago. But unfortunately, not long after, the husband died of a sudden heart attack, and the business venture that he'd sunk all their money into, it went belly up, and so the family was now bankrupt, and the 2 sons, they had to quit high school, and they had to go to work. In fact, just to make ends meet, they had to take a second shift over at the factory where they were working. And there at the factory, they met a couple of girls outside of their race and their religion, and they got married, a fact that was hard for their grieving mother to swallow. And then one night, while they were returning home after the late shift in the wee hours of the morning, the older brother who was at the wheel, he fell asleep. Tragic accident. They both were killed. And now the woman who previously had it all had nothing. And in her bitterness, She felt that God was against her. And so she told the girls, "Go back home, go." One of them did, but the other didn't. Sounds sort of familiar, doesn't it? All we have to do is change a few details and transport the characters back about 3,000 years. Folks, the book of Ruth takes place, we're told, when the judges ruled. We learned about them last week. Perhaps it was around the time when Gideon was ruling. Let's recall that this period of the judges, it's a morally chaotic time, this rather sad period down in the lower story of God's people. It lasted about 300 years. It encompassed no less than 6 different occupations and oppressions by the worst of the Hebrews' sworn enemies. And as we learned in the last verse of the book of Judges from last week, God nevertheless seemed to sovereignly allow these calamities to happen because, as it said, in those days Israel had no king. And so everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Yeah, in the lower story, God's chosen people, they looked more like a reality show that's gone horribly wrong than a beacon of hope. They totally had abandoned God's upper story plan over and over again. They looked more like the island of misfit toys than the light to the world. In fact, the light had gone out of God's people. It was a dark time. And folks, this period, in it, we see 6 details that sharpen our focus right out of the gates. First, there was a famine in the land. And secondly, this famine impacted a certain man together with his wife and 2 sons. And third, this man would take his family to live for a while in a foreign country. We find 2 wrongs here. He abandoned God's promised land, a no-no if you were a Jew. And to make matters worse, he took his family to live in the land of God's enemies, Moab. Friends, the Moabites, as you may recall, or probably not, they were the product of the incestuous relationship between Abraham's nephew Lot about 1,000 years before and one of Lot's daughters. And ever since, the relationship between Moab and Israel had been a bit testy, to say the least. So to go and live in Moab as one of God's chosen people was an egregious slap in God's face. Fourth, all 4 family members are identified by name. Elimelech, the father and husband, his wife Naomi, their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And fifth, we learn that they are from Bethlehem in Judah, which is about 50 miles northwest of where they end up in Moab. And dear ones, Bethlehem literally means house of bread, which is sort of ironic, don't you think, in light of the famine from which they fled. And sixth, we also discover that these 4 were Ephrathites, an old name for the Bethlehem region, which may sort of indicate old residents, almost kind of conveying the sense of moneyed aristocracy. And what's interesting, as this segment of the story unfolds, is that of the 4 people we just met, folks, we immediately read the obituaries of 3 of them. First, Elimelech, the dad, dies, leaving only Naomi and her 2 sons. And then the boys, they marry 2 Moabite women in direct violation of God's law. Their names are Orpah and Ruth. And shortly thereafter, the 2 sons die, and now Naomi has neither her husband or her beloved boys. Ironically, the very reason they left Bethlehem was to escape death, and yet death overtakes 75% of the family. Needless to say, the future looks pretty bleak. They can't survive where they are now living. And so Naomi hears that the God of both the feast and the famine had come to the aid of Israel by restocking Bethlehem, the house of bread. And so Naomi prepares to return home. And evidently, in the time that they had been together, interestingly enough, Naomi had acquired a genuine affection for her 2 daughter-in-laws. And wanting the best for them, folks know mother-in-law jokes can be made in this book. She kisses them goodbye, and she tells them to go home and to find new husbands. And when the daughter-in-laws say, "Heck, no, we won't go," Naomi responds with a lecture in logic. And folks, just one of her deductive reasonings should have been enough to send those daughter-in-laws scurrying home. But like an avalanche, of which my wife saw evidence of a lot of those out west, you know, if you dodge one stone, there are plenty of others, which makes you wonder if Elimelech, her husband, ever won any disputes with this woman. Well, folks, we won't go into her avalanche of reasons why the girls should go home, or we would be here all day. But let it be enough to say that Naomi, she considered herself to be divinely jinxed by God. And she didn't want it to rub off on these young women. Friends, sort of like Job, another guy from the Old Testament, Naomi was embittered toward God. Yeah, she believed in God, and she didn't exactly give up on him, but she didn't believe in his goodness anymore. And maybe there are times in your life when you can relate. Have you ever experienced disappointment with God? It happens when you do what you think the Lord wants, but then things don't turn out the way that you expected. God, he just doesn't come through. You stick your neck out and you do the ethical thing at work, and you expect to get praise, but then you get fired. What's with that, God? Naomi was disappointed with God because she had lost her husband, she had lost her 2 sons, she had lost her wealth, and she had lost her social standing. And then in the midst of all of this, she now sees life through this jaded lens. Naomi felt that God was out to get her. I like what John Piper has to say. He writes, I take Naomi's theology any day over the sentimental hogwash that's dominating evangelical magazines and books these days, because Naomi is certain about 3 things. First, God exists. Secondly, he's sovereign. And thirdly, he has afflicted her. I agree, says Piper. But Naomi also forgot that God can turn tragedy into triumph, Piper adds. And dear ones, as the story will unfold in the moments ahead, we'll see that Naomi's attitude needs to be transformed when she gains some altitude, when she sees her lower story circumstances from God's upper story point of view, then everything's going to make sense. So she tries to send the girls back home, and one, Orpah, does go back home, but the other, Ruth, in a God-ordained moment, decides to leave behind all that she's ever known, her people and her family and her pagan god Shamash. And she's going to make her part with Naomi, with her people, and with her God. And we hear it in some of the most powerful words that were ever uttered in the Bible. And these by a pagan woman who is outside the promises of God. Listen to these words again. Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. And your people will be my people, and your God, my God. And where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you from me. Folks, it seems that Ruth and Naomi are bound together literally till death do them part, and even beyond that. Because Ruth's words here suggest that even after Naomi dies, that Ruth will live with Naomi's people, and eventually she shall be buried with Naomi. And I know that these are words that we use often at weddings, and they have nothing to do whatsoever with anything romantic, and yet they express some of the most profoundly deep human love that we could ever know. So Naomi is not alone. Someone has her back in this world, and it's not just Ruth. Friends, as today's lesson closes, they arrive in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And yes, Naomi is still bitter. She even retorts to the gawking townswomen, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara," which means bitter, because I left full, but I return empty. She still sees herself there at the center of the bullseye of God's cosmic target practice. She returns home in shame. She's impoverished. She's lost everything. And of course, what does she have but in tow an enemy, a Moabite woman? I'm sure that they were quite the talk of the town, but now another favorable divine apple falls from the tree, for we discover that Naomi, she has a wealthy relative of much standing in the community, and his name is Boaz. And gentlemen, if you thought that I had forgotten you today on this Father's Day, then think again, because Boaz is one of the best models in the Bible of what a godly man should look like. And let's see why. Folks, since it was the barley harvest, and since Naomi and Ruth needed a way to be able to survive, after all, as the fast food commercial says, you got to eat, right? Ruth suggested to Naomi that she should go out and glean in the fields. You see, God had made provision for the vulnerable amongst his people down there in the trenches of the lower stories of life, especially the alien, the widow, the orphan. And Ruth knows that she qualifies on 2 out of those 3 accounts. But of what do we speak? You see, gleaning was a practice in which the vulnerable could go and pick up the leftover grain which had been left behind by the harvesters. In fact, I'm pretty well acquainted with gleaning. You see, when my sister and I were young, my dad would pay my sister and I, as we grew up on the farm, so much per ear of corn that we would glean from the fields that the corn picker would leave behind. Naomi, she would have been too old to glean, so Ruth said, "I'll go." I've got to tell you that the NIV is a bit too tame for my taste in describing what happens next, because it uses the phrase, as it turned out. Because the Hebrew literally says, her chances chanced upon. The words make it clear that this is one of those God-wink moments. It's under the providential upper story direction of God. Because it seems on her first day of gleaning that out of all of the many fields outside of Bethlehem, that Ruth just coincidentally happens to show up in Boaz's field. And it also just so happens that as she arrives, that Boaz shows up to check up on the progress of the harvest. And noticing this obviously unfamiliar young foreign single woman, half of his age, what would be his initial response? I mean, let's remember, folks, Bethlehem is this tiny little town where everybody knows each other. And you got this single woman from an enemy state. She is ripe for harassment, and yet imagine if a woman wearing a Muslim burqa just suddenly out of the blue stopped to pick some leftover fruits in one of our local orchards late in the fall season. Sure. Can you say Homeland Security? And yet, if God is really up to something, then it's going to require some faith on Ruth's parts. So Ruth steps out in faith. And how does God respond to her? Well, Boaz, he could have shooed her away. He could have said, "Get out of my fields, woman. You have no right to be here. You're stealing from my own people's mouths." But instead, when he finds out the kindness that Ruth has shown his kinswoman, Naomi, by coming back with her from Moab, he showers her with kindness. He invites her to glean all that she wants and to drink from the jars of water that he provides for his workers. In fact, he even tells his workers to deliberately leave a little extra grain behind so Ruth wouldn't have to work so hard. And even more, he warns his men, don't lay a finger on her. Guys, men, Boaz is hereby instituting the first anti-sexual harassment policy in recorded history. And folks, let's understand this little so-called town of Bethlehem, it wasn't exactly Mayberry. It had its problems just like any other town, and yet in that community, Boaz was a businessman, business guys, who lived out his faith wherever he went, including the workplace. Remember, these were the days of the judges when everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and Boaz would have had some pretty tough hombres working for him. And yet, amidst all of this, he lets his light shine. He's honorable. He's upright. He honors the opposite sex. There is no hint of impropriety of his part in dealing with Ruth. Even though she's vulnerable, even though she's a Moabite and a widow as well. Literally, Boaz assumes the role of both protector and provider. And when Ruth is astounded at such a kindness, and she asks why she has received such favor as a foreigner, Boaz blesses her with a blessing that the God of Israel was now allowing Ruth to take refuge under his wings. And folks, Boaz doesn't realize it yet, but God is going to use him to be the ultimate fulfillment of this blessing. So Ruth, she rushes back home and she tells Naomi her news. And for the first time in a long while, Naomi begins to taste hope again. Because immediately God begins to ignite in her heart his upper story vision for a happy ending. You know, one of those intersections where the upper story and the lower stories come together. And so she begins to explain to Ruth just who this Boaz is. Ruth, he's our Goel. He's our kinsman redeemer. Our who's he, what's this? Says Ruth. What's a kinsman redeemer? Folks, the term Goel likely carried little significance for a foreigner like Ruth. But in the Old Testament, to the Jewish people, the Goel had family responsibilities according to the law to make restitution, to carry out justice, to protect family-owned lands, and to also continue on the family line. The root of the word Goel means to redeem. So when Naomi told Ruth that night that God was showing kindness to the dead, she was speaking of an Old Testament practice known as the Levirate marriage, in which a presumably unmarried brother would marry his brother's childless widow in order to have offspring and to carry on his line in perpetuity. This was the role of the kinsman redeemer, that if there was not a brother, then the nearest kinsman down the line would step in. And folks, in Ruth chapter 1, which we read, we saw that Naomi was dismal. But as chapter 2 closes, Naomi is now delighted. As we said before, it's amazing what a little altitude can do for one's attitude. For Naomi is now able to lift her eyes up from the muck and the mire of her lower story troubles to see what God is doing in the upper story. At this point, Ruth is only thinking barley, but Naomi is thinking bride. Ruth is thinking bread, but Naomi is thinking a wedding cake. Ruth is thinking about grain, but Naomi is thinking about being a grandma. So did God immediately kick things off between Ruth and Boaz? Well, not exactly. The good news is that Boaz, over the rest of the barley harvest, which was a couple of months, he continues, to be chivalrous and respectful. But for Naomi, the bad news is that Boaz has said and done nothing more than be gracious. In fact, if Naomi were to write for some advice to a second millennium BC advice columnist, it might have read something like this. Dear Abigail, my widowed daughter-in-law has daily contact with an older man who shows concern and respect for her. In fact, from the moment he saw her, he was deeply interested, and he has treated her like a princess. But now, fast forward 2 months, and he still hasn't said one word to take the relationship to the next level. She likes him, but he's not getting any younger. So how do I get him to ignite his inertia, to light his lethargy, to cancel his coma, signed befuddled in Bethlehem? You see, Boaz has no immediate plans to update his bachelor status on JewishMingle.com. And we're still, tonight's the last night of the harvest celebration, when the regular daily contact between Ruth and Boaz is going to come to an end. It was time for some initiative. It was time to take some action. So Naomi approaches young Ruth, and she hatches a plan. And she says, hey, kiddo, it's time we find you a home of your own. It's time for you to take off your mourning clothes and to get back in the dating game. So here's what we're going to do. Tonight, when old Boaz finishes winnowing the barley on the threshing floor, beforehand, make yourself attractive, be attentive, be assertive, be available. Yeah, wash and perfume yourself. That would have been a visual announcement that she was ready to return to regular life. And then don't let him know that you're there until he's finished celebrating the harvest. But when he lies down, notice what barley pile he lies down in for the night. After all, if you're going to take a roll in the hay with somebody, it's a good idea to know which hay mow they're in. And then go and uncover his feet, Ruth, and lie down there. Literally, that symbolized a humble means of approach. Not brazen, yet it also would have awakened the old guy gradually, not suddenly, so that Boaz's feet wouldn't have gotten cold too quickly. Once he's awake, then be available. Take your cues from him. He'll tell you what to do. So Ruth, she follows Naomi's advice. She uncovers Boaz's feet. She lies down, and when he awakes and discovers Ruth lying there, Ruth made her desire for marriage perfectly clear. Spread the corner of your garment over me, she said. An idiom back then which meant basically, hey, how about we get hitched? And just so he got the message, Ruth reminded him that he was her Goel, her kinsman redeemer. So how did Boaz respond to this surprise proposal in the middle of the night? Very favorably. And being the man of integrity he was, guys, he did not take advantage of her. He sent her back home the next morning. Because he wasn't the first in line, he went to the guy who was the first in line for kinsman redeemer rights. He got things worked out. And it ends up that we witness one of the great stories of the Bible. Ruth and Boaz get married. And even though this book is about Ruth, a woman of extraordinary faith and character, guys, the real character, the real Christ figure in this tale is Boaz. Because men, he foreshadows for us the true kinsman redeemer who is to come. For in fulfilling his role as the family guardian, Boaz becomes the great grandfather of none other than David. And therefore the direct ancestor of guess who? Jesus, who would be born over 1,000 years later, guess where? In Bethlehem. Just like Jesus, Boaz would have a tender heart for the outsiders of this world, because didn't we learn a couple of weeks ago that he is the direct descendant of Rahab, the harlot, who also was in the genealogy of Jesus? So throughout the story, folks, we get to see God working behind the lower story scenes to bring about his upper story plans. And we could get lost in this story, 3 widows, death, destitution, bitterness. And yet we know something good is coming. We've seen it time and time again in the stories of Gideon and Abraham and Joseph, that when it looks the bleakest, that's when God is at his very best. He reminds us all, if you are in a family that is broken and blended, come and find rest under the shadow of my wings. And all of God's people said together, amen.